Please welcome Principal James Sanders and Associates, James Sanders.
Thank you. I am James Sanders, as the man said. I am an architect in New York and an author and a filmmaker. And I'm here to talk about something a little different than I think most of the other presentations. I'm not here to offer any strategy, but rather to talk sort of essentially about the magic of places. I think you can't really be involved in the world of travel without being really profoundly interested in places and what they mean. And in my case, it's particularly to do with cities. Did I get the, there we go. And I'm here to talk about a kind of city of dreams. And that city is New York, but not necessarily the New York that we're sitting in right now, but rather the dream city of New York. And my argument is that this dream city, this magical place that was created in the minds of so many people over the 20th century, was a product in large part of our greatest of dream media, which is the movies. And I'm going to tell you a little bit, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour perhaps of that dream city of the movies for fun, and then tell you a little bit briefly about how it came to be and where it is today. It's a city that everyone knows all around the world. It is obviously the most common thing that people talk about, that as they come to the real city, what they have in their mind is not only the city that they see, but the city that they have known all their lives from watching movies and television. It's a place which is arguably scarier, more exciting, more dramatic, more romantic, more dynamic even than the real place. And it's built over the texture of literally hundreds and hundreds of feature films that have been made over the years. Many of them the best known films ever made, some of them less well known, many of them including incredible moments that none of us can forget. Some of it created in actual real locations, some of it from invented places that were created in London and Berlin, and most of all in Los Angeles and Hollywood. And it is a place that just is a fixture in the popular imagination of the 20th century and now the 21st century. But how did it come to be, and what, why has it been so powerful in the imagination? It has its origins, interestingly, on the streets of the city itself. Most people, most Americans certainly associate the movies with Hollywood and California, but any look at the history of the movies will tell you that the movies were not born in California. In fact, Los Angeles and Hollywood were orange groves primarily when the movies were born in the 1890s. The place the movies were born was New York. Thomas Edison developed his technology right outside the city and almost immediately moved into the city to start making the first commercial films, and almost immediately had some rivals. And what were these films and what did they show? In many cases, in the beginning, they had no stories, no plots, no characters. They didn't know movies could do those things yet. They were what we would call documentaries, but they didn't call them, they called them actualities. And they just took moments of real life of the city. A woman on a street, as you saw before, or here, just the New York City subway system, the newly built IRT. To show off. Because remember, in those days, things like this, the new subway, the new electric underground railroad of New York, was like, you know, the Apollo project, and was the most exciting thing happening of its day. So these extraordinary actuality films filled the screens all over the world and all over the United States, bringing the real city and already sort of heightening it to something greater. That really took off in the 1920s when the first dramatic films were being made and feature-length films were being made. And a lot of those, too, were being shot on the streets and rooftops, as you see here. An extraordinary film called Play Ball being shot in roughly 1925. And you see what's happening is that they're doing a stunt scene. A woman is hanging off a constructed wall, parapet, sitting on top of an actual building. Of course, she luckily has that blanket there, that mattress to protect her in case all goes wrong. But using the actual fabric of the city as the most kind of amazing show on earth. And that went on all the way through the 1920s, in part because the movies were silent. But a big problem emerged in the late 1920s. The movies learned to talk. It wasn't a big problem for the movies, but it was a big problem for New York because New York was very noisy. And it was very difficult to shoot the kinds of scenes you saw before. Also, the industry by then had substantially located its production facilities, not the other parts of the business. The marketing and the promotion and the executive offices remained in New York in Times Square, but the actual production went out to this place, Los Angeles, not the city we know today, certainly, a very low-rise, very almost suburban place. But my argument, it is out of the New Yorkers who had come to Los Angeles, some of them the studio executives, many of them the writers, who had been brought out to write those, what? Talkies. Needed dialogue, so you needed the writers. They came to this place, having been in that other place, and they invented this place, which was not Hollywood, that's for sure, but nor was it the actual location, New York. It was instead a kind of dream version of what New York could be. This is actually a production design sketch from RKO of a Fred Astaire movie from the 1930s. A kind of larger-than-life magical place that was a combination of sort of memory and imagination. And for the next many years, promulgated this amazing dream vision for decades and decades, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. Now, of course, naturally, because it was being shot 3,000 miles away from the real place, you had to kind of build it. And so what you saw, in fact, and what looked like and felt like a real city was actually, as you see here, made of pieces, whether shot on a soundstage. They used things like miniatures, which were sort of extraordinary. This is for the movie Rope. Here's one of my favorite shots of Mr. Hitchcock enjoying the miniature New York that he had brought into being for it, sitting on a cloud. These vast paintings that were used, extraordinary things. Indeed, I so fell in love with these paintings that I got an opportunity in 2007 to do an exhibition in Grand Central Terminal based on my book Celluloid Skyline, sponsored by Turner Classic Movies, which brought some of the actual MGM scenic backings to New York. And they were so large, the only place we could put them up was Vanderbilt Hall in Grand Central. You'll recognize, the movie buffs of you will recognize the image on the left as being the United Nations backing from North by Northwest, the actual painting that Cary Grant ran in front of. That went on for decades, but starting in the late 1940s and prompted largely by the rise of a new kind of filmmaking that was emerging mostly in Italy. Neorealism, it was called, in the late 1940s, getting away from Cinecittà, which was the big Mussolini associated with sort of fascism, Mussolini and all that. These newer, younger generations of filmmakers wanted to work on the streets of Rome and the streets of Italian cities. So they began to do that and began to make amazing films. And New York filmmakers began to try to emulate that. So starting in 1948 with the making of The Naked City, which you see here being filmed on the Williamsburg Bridge. Then the first musical to be shot on location substantially was On the Town, 1949. And by 1952, you had the making of On the Waterfront. A little bit different because the earlier films were actually shot on location in New York, but they were basically Hollywood crews that had come to New York. But what these guys started to do, Kazan and those guys, was actually begin to build an indigenous industry where the camera people and the set people and all the production people would be based in New York as well, and large parts of it were actually filmed. Even the famous I Could Have Been a Contender scene was shot on a Fox studio, old Fox studio on 10th Avenue and 52nd Street. By the early 1960s, although the movies shot on location in New York were not numerous, they were the cutting edge of filmmaking in the United States. And films like, all of these shots, and name is escaping me suddenly, West Side Story, were shot on location, these amazing reimaginations of how you could use the actual city, in this case, the old tenements that were about to be torn down for the building of Lincoln Center, for these new kinds of scenes. And instead of being constrained to a stage floor, you now could have the dancers move down the stage and move down the street. And of course, Jerome Robbins, the choreographer of this amazing film, actually began to use the freedom of the street to be able to do new kinds of dance moves, as you see here. Made the Same Summer, amazingly, Breakfast at Tiffany's, a perfect example of how you could take the kind of magic of the kind of Hollywood idea about New York and bring it to locations. Although one has to say, in this, as in West Side Story, much of the film was actually shot in Hollywood sound stages. Only certain sections of the film would be shot on location. The great story about this is that they tried to shoot it early in the morning on a Sunday morning in front of Tiffany's, hoping that they wouldn't have any crowds. They were still very concerned about crowd control in those days. And crowds gathered anyway, seeing all the police squad cars and everything like that, and assuming that a robbery was in progress at Tiffany's. It was just Audrey. A big change happened in 1966 because the then mayor, John Lindsay, newly elected, made a major effort to bring production back to New York. He created the first Mayor's Office of Film, it's now called the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment. It was the first film office of its kind in the world, the first city bureaucracy whose job it was not to make things hard on filmmakers, but to make it easy. So they introduced a lot of innovations. One-stop permitting, that was a big deal. You went to the office one time, you told them where you wanted to shoot, and you didn't have to keep going to every police precinct and getting separate permits. Also a special police unit that would go around and you didn't have to bribe and so forth. And it had an instant success. Instantly, within a few years, the number of films being made in New York went from something like 10 to 40 and then to 80. Now, ironically, the particular time that those films were being made sort of coincided with maybe the nadir of the modern city, of the contemporary city, the late 1960s and the early 1970s, when the city was kind of at its most despairing and a lot of people had left and there was a lot of crime and disorder, and a lot of films reflected that, and films kind of maybe over-exaggerated it, perhaps. On the way, however, some of the great classics of American modern film, like Midnight Cowboy, were being made. And films like Taxi Driver. Dark, dark visions of the city, to be sure, but also incredibly powerful in their magnetism. And as some of you know, younger people, I think, who are coming to New York now sort of wonder why it can't be like this anymore. This was the New York that they were hoping to find. Of course, those years also brought Woody Allen's early great comedies, romantic comedies, which established a kind of made, by the way, almost at the exact same time. I told Scorsese, I said, you know that you and Allen were filming Taxi Driver and Annie Hall at almost exactly the same time, two more disparate visions of the city one can't imagine. And he said, really? I didn't know that. Ironically, it would have been, you might have said, Woody Allen's vision that was the fantasy vision, and it was Taxi Driver that represented the reality, but actually that's not the way it worked out. The city continued actually and became safe again and began to prosper, and the film stayed with it. One, I think, wonderful thing about location shooting was that it brought attention to all sorts of parts of the city that one might not otherwise see, and a great example of that, of course, would be Spike Lee's early films shot in Bedford, this one, Do the Right Thing, of course, shot in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and showing us a kind of almost anthropological slice of New York life that we might not otherwise get to see. And the films carried on through the 1990s and into the 2000s. 13 going on 30. She's supposed to be 13 years old, and she's wandering through Times Square in the back of her limousine. And so that kind of transformation of the city to the city we know today, essentially a safe place, a benign, safe place whose main issues have to do with its popularity and its success. Films that have continued to track the story of New York into the 2000s. This is the sequel to Wall Street, and of course, very poignantly and powerfully showing behind the scene in the World Financial Center, Ground Zero. Now, of course, Ground Zero is almost completely rebuilt, so this film will stand now in decades to come as capturing a moment in time that's now gone forever. Here's Will Smith in the latest Men in Black. Men in Black is a gigantic production, $80 million, $90 million, who knows, maybe more. Shot not only, this is the big difference, not only on the streets of the city here in Soho, now with the idea, by the way, that they're sent back in time so New York can be the New York that it was in the 1960s. This is supposed to be, Andy Warhol's factory, but also shot on the stages. Now, an interesting thing to begin to close up here, changing the way the city works is the sense of New York's power as a tourist attraction, of course, driven by films like Sex and the City in obvious ways, but less obvious in the sense that location shooting itself, which began as a kind of little thing that you would catch if you happen to be at the right place at the right time. Now, thanks to social media and apps and websites, it has become an attraction of New York. People gather. Here's the shooting of the Sex and the City movie, and you can see this huge crowd has assembled because they know the location scene is going to happen, and they all want to see Sarah Jessica Parker and company. So now location shooting has become, in fact, part of the draw of the city. One more way in which this kind of world of films has contributed to this extraordinary cultural construct that is the dream city of New York. Thanks very much.